Devonte Hart stood in the middle of a bustling street in downtown Portland, gripping a cardboard sign with both hands. The words, "Free Hugs," were painted in bold black letters across the sign. And underneath, a heart symbol was drawn in red. His small, 12-year-old frame was almost dwarfed by the crowd around him. But Devonte didn't feel small. For the first time, he felt powerful. Next to him, his adoptive mother, Jen, stood with a mix of pride and worry etched on her face. She had watched her son grow up in a world that didn't always treat him kindly. And now, she was watching him stand up for what he believed in. The protest that day was about more than just a court ruling, it was about Devonte's future. His identity. And his place in a country that didn't always feel like home. The events in Ferguson had lit a fire in him. A young black teenager, unarmed, had been shot dead by a white police officer. And when the jury decided to acquit the officer, people across the nation were enraged. Protests erupted in cities from coast to coast. Portland, Oregon, was no different. Devonte had seen the news coverage every night. He watched as people marched in the streets, chanting for justice, demanding change. He had listened to Jen talk about racism, about inequality, and about how, despite the civil rights movement decades ago, black people in America were still fighting for the right to live safely in their own skin. And now, Devonte was here. His "Free Hugs" sign wasn't just a plea for kindness, it was a protest against fear, against hatred, and against the violence that seemed to follow people like him. The streets of Portland were filled with protesters, holding signs, waving flags, and chanting in unison. The voices of hundreds, maybe thousands, echoed through the city, bouncing off the brick buildings and spreading through every corner of the downtown district. Devonte held his sign up high, his arms beginning to ache from holding it for so long. But he didn't lower it. He could hear the chants around him: Black Lives Matter, no justice, no peace, hands up, don't shoot. His heart beat faster with every chant. The energy in the air was electric, charged with both anger and hope. He was surrounded by people of all races, all ages, all walks of life. There were old men with graying beards, young women with piercings and tattoos, children younger than him on their parents' shoulders. And in the middle of it all was Devonte, a 12-year-old boy with a cardboard sign. For a moment, he felt a strange sense of unity. He wasn't just Devonte Hart, a kid who had been adopted into a loving white family. He wasn't just the quiet boy who had been bullied in school for being different. He was part of something larger. A movement. A fight for something greater than himself. As Devonte marched alongside Jen, he thought about the stories she had told him over the years. He remembered sitting at the dinner table, listening to her talk about Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and the civil rights marches of the 1960s. Back then, Jen had said, people fought for the right to sit where they wanted on a bus, to go to the same schools, to vote. They fought for basic human dignity. Devonte had always felt a disconnect from those stories. They seemed like ancient history, something that belonged in textbooks, far removed from his own life. But now, as he marched through the streets of Portland, he realized that history wasn't so far away. The struggle wasn't over. The faces in the black and white photos Jen had shown him were now replaced by people like him, still fighting for the same basic rights. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders. It was a heavy burden to carry. But it was also a privilege. Devonte knew that he was standing on the shoulders of giants, of people who had risked their lives so that he could stand here today, holding his sign. But as much as he respected those who came before him, Devonte also felt the sting of frustration. How could it be that after all this time? After all the progress that had been made, young black men were still being killed by police. How could it be that the color of someone's skin could still determine whether they lived or died? As the protest moved toward the city square, the mood shifted. The chants grew louder, more urgent. And there was a tension in the air that Devonte couldn't quite put into words. He could see it in the way people's faces tightened, in the way their hands clenched their signs just a little harder. Up ahead, Devonte saw a line of police officers, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces blank behind riot helmets. They held batons in their hands, and their presence alone was enough to make his stomach churn. Devonte had heard Jen talk about the police. She had told him that not all cops were bad, that there were good officers who genuinely wanted to protect people. But she had also told him to be careful. "You're black, Devonte," she had said, her voice full of both love and fear. "You can't afford to make mistakes around them. You need to be extra careful." Now, standing just a few feet from a line of armed officers, Devonte felt the truth of her words deep in his bones. His heart raced, and his palms began to sweat as he clutched his sign a little tighter. Suddenly, someone in the crowd threw a bottle. It wasn't clear where it came from, but the effect was immediate. The bottle shattered on the ground near the police. And within seconds, everything descended into chaos. The officers advanced, and the crowd surged backward. Tear gas canisters were fired into the air, exploding with loud pops as thick white smoke began to fill the streets. People screamed and scattered, pushing and shoving in their rush to get away. Devonte lost sight of Jen. Panic gripped his chest as he called out for her. But his voice was drowned out by the chaos around him. His eyes stung from the tear gas, and he could feel his lungs burning as he struggled to breathe. He stumbled, nearly tripping over his own feet as he tried to find a way out of the smoke-filled street. Devonte's heart raced as he weaved through the crowd, searching desperately for his mother. His vision blurred from the tear gas, and his breathing was labored, each breath a painful struggle. All around him, people were shouting, running, pushing past him in their frantic attempts to escape. "Mom," he shouted. But his voice was swallowed by the noise. He couldn't see her anywhere. And the fear inside him grew with every passing second. What if something had happened to her? What if she had been hurt? The thought sent a wave of panic through him. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. But he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. Not now. He had to find her. Devonte ran toward a side street, away from the thickest part of the crowd. His legs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and sluggish from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But he pushed himself forward, determined to get out of the chaos and find Jen. After what felt like an eternity, Devonte reached a quieter area of the city. The sounds of the protest were still audible in the distance, but the immediate danger had passed. He stopped to catch his breath, his chest heaving as he leaned against a lamppost. His lungs burned from the tear gas, and his eyes were red and swollen from the irritation. A few other protesters had gathered nearby, their faces showing the same mix of exhaustion and fear that Devonte felt. One of them, a woman with a bandana tied over her nose and mouth, approached him and offered him a bottle of water. "Are you okay, kid?" she asked, her voice muffled through the cloth. Devonte nodded, though he didn't feel okay. He felt scared and alone. He wanted to cry, but he held back the tears. He couldn't let himself break down. Not yet. He had to find his mother. Devonte continued his search, making his way back toward the heart of the protest, now much quieter than before. The crowd had dispersed in many areas, But pockets of protesters remained, still holding signs and chanting for justice. And then, finally, he saw her. Jen was standing near the steps of a building. Her face flushed but determined. She had found a small group of protesters. And they were forming a human chain, holding hands as a sign of solidarity. "Mom!" Devonte shouted, running toward her. Jen turned at the sound of his voice. And relief washed over her face. She rushed to him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I was so scared," Devonte whispered, his voice trembling as he buried his face in her shoulder. "Me too," Jen replied, holding him even tighter. "But we're okay. We're okay." That night, after the protest, Devonte sat on the couch, staring at the TV as news channels replayed footage of the day's events. He could see the crowds, the signs, the chants, and then the chaos that had erupted when the tear gas was deployed. He thought about the faces he had seen, the voices he had heard. He thought about the man who had thrown the bottle that started it all. He didn't understand why people resorted to violence during protests. But he also didn't understand why the police had to respond with such force. It felt like a never-ending cycle, violence breeding more violence, fear breeding more fear. But amidst all the chaos, there had also been moments of hope. Devonte remembered the feeling of unity he had felt when he first joined the protest. The sense of belonging that came from standing up for what was right. And he knew that despite the fear and the danger, he would do it all again if it meant fighting for justice. The next morning, Devonte woke up with a new sense of purpose. The events of the day before had shaken him, but they had also strengthened his resolve. He had seen firsthand the power of standing up for what was right, even in the face of danger. Devonte knew that his fight was far from over. The protest in Portland was just one small part of a much larger movement. And he was determined to be a part of it. He wanted to learn more about his history, about the struggles of Black people in America, and about how he could contribute to making the world a better place for future generations. As he sat at the kitchen table with Jen, he looked up at her and said, "I want to do more. Mom. I want to keep fighting." Jen smiled, her eyes full of pride. "You will, Devonte. You already are." And in that moment, Devonte knew that his journey was just beginning.